Hey everybody out there, this is Seto, and today for you guys we are back outside in the great outdoors, and today for you guys we're going to be talking about two interesting topics, as you can see by the title. The first topic we're going to be discussing about is, have archetypes been around a lot longer than people give them credit for? Mainly, have they been under a different name and people just really haven't looked at the coincidences between the two things? I'll get more into that and explain it a little bit more in detail as I get into the topic. The second thing we're going to be talking about is, did archetypes actually save Yu-Gi-Oh! To some extent? Did it make it be able to last as long as it has been because of archetypes? Now, I know right off the bat people are going to say, Seto, archetypes have ruined the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! They destroyed the game, they made it stagnant and boring and etc, etc, etc. I'm not saying I disagree with you on some of those things, but I'm just saying I'm playing devil's advocate here. That's all I'm doing. I'm looking at the other side of the coin here, so we can maybe find what maybe Konami was thinking back in the day when they kind of made archetypes more mainstream over the last couple of years. So that's just what this video is going to be about. And you may be asking yourself, Seto, how do you also come up with this freaking idea of, did archetypes save the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Or, have archetypes been around a lot longer than people believe they have been? And the reason I'm doing this video is because over the last week or so, I guess you could say the last week and a half, I've been doing actually a lot of reading, and a lot of reading on old Yu-Gi-Oh! Articles. I'm not joking. I've been on Pojo, I've been on a whole bunch of different old websites with old postings, and they literally have the date 2004 or 2003 and 2005. So pretty much I'm going to be talking about specifically 03, 04, 05, and those years. But I've been reading a lot of deck lists, a lot of discussions about the meta back then, just a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh! History in general. And I found that a lot of people nowadays, they just say, back then it was more creative, etc., etc., there's more diversity, things of this nature. And I find that most of the people that were saying this were people from this day in time, this, last year or so, the last 2 to 3 years, there were certain people that had keep saying it. And I just said, from my studies in history, because I love history so much, I find that I would rather, take the evidence from personary source. So what I mean by that, by taking it from first person account, what the people back then were saying, not what the people nowadays are saying. What were the people in 2003 and 2004 and 2005 saying about their meta, what they felt like was happening to the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! And things of that nature. Instead of just asking somebody 10 years later, let's ask the people back then. And that's what I did with this video. So my apologies for going on for 3 minutes just explaining this topic, but I think it's something you're going to thoroughly enjoy. So, as I was getting into this topic, I was reading a lot of articles back then, and in 2003, 2004, there was a lot of, archetypes that were around. There was not archetypes, but you had some archetypes around. In 2003, 2004, you mainly had Gravekeepers, Amazons, Horus level 6, the Horus archetype. Agents had just come out, kind of, in the middle of 2004. You had Exodia had become an archetype. Dark Magician had become its own archetype by 2004. So there were archetypes, but they weren't dominating the meta like today. So, you know how we can compare like non-archetype decks winning in today's game? That's how rare it was to see archetypes winning back then. It was very rare to see archetypes topping at major events. Until Chaos came out, then you saw Grave people taking in Necro Valleys and Gravekeepers. But the main decks for back then that were being played were Beatdown, which was kind of funny because a whole bunch of players back then were complaining about Beatdown type of decks, which is pretty much just big beaters. They were saying it's not creative, which by today's standards we would say that maybe is creative. Then you had hand control type of decks with Yada Lock and Forceful Sentry, Delinquent Duo, things of this nature, Donza Luke. Then you had things like the Magical Scientist OTK type of decks with Catapult Turtle, which was the first deck that really used the extra deck. Then you had things like Burn with Lava Golem, and then you had Chaos that came in 2004. And then you had this thing that gets to the topic of why it's called, did archetypes been around a lot longer than people give them credit for, is themed-based decks. Now what's a theme-based deck? Now when I think of a theme-based deck in 2015, I'm thinking of somebody saying, this is a Yugi Moto deck, or this is a Merrick deck, or this is a Bakura deck, or a Jaden Yuki, or a Yusei Fudo deck. That's what I'm thinking. It's a character-based deck, it's a themed-based deck. But that's not the case for 2004, 2003, and 2005. A theme-based deck back in the day, and I can say this from personal experience as well, and after reading the articles it finally clicked with me, it's kind of like an archetype. Now you may say to yourself, what's that mean, Seto? An archetype? A theme is an archetype? I don't get it. Okay, so back in the day, a themed type of deck was something that you would call like a zombie deck, or a dragon deck, or you would call maybe like a fire deck or a chaos deck. So decks mostly back then, the ones that were topping mainly, were more of a combination of good solid cards in 2004, 2003, and 5, and also just good cards that help that deck reach its end goal. So a good example is chaos decks. So your main goal in the chaos was, you had all these good cards, Regeki, Harpy's Feathers, Delinquent Duo, Pot of Greed, Graceful Charity, things like that. But you also had your end goal in mind, which is to fill the grave up with lights and darks, get your big boss monsters out, which was Chaos Emperor Dragon and BLS, and proceed to win the duel that way, or lock your opponent out with a Yada Lock or beat down from there. So that's what Chaos kind of did. So decks back then, they had a whole bunch of good cards that were staple deck cards, which is a topic for another day. And then you had your themed base cards. So let's go with zombies here. So with zombies, you would run your generic cards, your Pot of Greed, your Regekis, your, whatever you want to run. And then you run your theme-based cards, your Pyramid Turtles, your Book of Lives, your Vampire Lord, which is a good card back then actually, and cards of this nature. Now you start looking at this and you say, I started noticing, I said, hey, these theme-based decks kind of look like precursors to archetype type of decks. I kind of felt like it was only like a little baby step, like maybe 1 or 2 steps this way, and it was an archetype. It kind of, what I'm trying to say is, it kind of looked like a, I guess I'll try to give an analogy here, is that they kind of looked like preemies. And what I mean by preemies, you know how like a premature baby kind of doesn't look like a human? It kind of looked like that. It was like a premature archetype deck. That's what theme decks kind of look like to me. And I had played with theme decks back in the day. I had played with zombies and stuff, but it didn't click till, reading these articles and going back through my mind saying, hey, these are kind of like archetypes. And it was mostly because of hindsight, I guess you could say. Looking through the past, looking forward 10 years, to now, knowing what we know about the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! And looking back, I was like, I could see comparisons, and I was like, theme-based decks are kind of like early archetype decks. And you're probably not going to understand this unless you go back, look online at theme-based decks like zombies and water-based decks and fire and dinosaur-based decks. They all kind of look like premature archetypes. Granted, in their name it didn't say mermaids. In their name it didn't say dark worlds. It had, they all had their own name, but they functioned like an archetype, kind of. Granted, they were an assortment of different cards, but they were specific, just like in an archetype. If you're playing Gravekeepers, you're going to play 3 Spy, your 3 Recruiter, your Necro Valley, your staple deck cards, which is a topic, like I said, for another day. But just like back then, you were running things like 3 Pyramid Turtle, your Spirit Reaper, your Jinzo, because that was considered a good card back then, your whatever else I'm trying to think of. I'm just having a brain fart. But you run your staple deck cards in each theme deck, kind of like an archetype. And then I start thinking a little bit deeper, and this is where I may lose some people here, but I started thinking a little bit deeper and saying to myself, so a lot of cards that are considered theme-based, we still run today, right? So for warrior decks back then, you had Marauding Captain, and then you had your theme-based, strictly based theme cards, kind of like for your warriors, that is. It was generic though. Excuse me for the bee flying around. Your warrior, your Rhoda, your warrior returning alive, your Marauding Captains, and some other cards in general. But you also look at now and you say to yourself, we still play these cards in even archetypes. They're that powerful. 3 Rhoda, everything searches. Granted, back then it was a very powerful card, but then it got me thinking to myself, maybe this is one of the reasons why Konami kind of switched over to archetypes. Now, the reason I'm saying this is because these cards, for the most of Yu-Gi-Oh's history, generic cards have been very powerful. Just about every generic card has been very powerful. Even Denko Sekka, even though it's just mainly played in certain decks, is a very powerful generic card. And generic cards give power to specific archetypes when they come out. A good example recently, look at Preparation of Rites, was made for themed-based archetypes. Yes, they would be, theme-based ritual decks, excuse me. So yeah, they would have been like Herald of Perfection or whatever else, Hungry Hamburger, but they were theme-based, kind of, because this was a theme type of card that could be put in these archetype decks and help these poor little decks out. But look what it did when a top-tier deck came in an archetype sense and got a hold of that theme card. It completely just made Necros amazing, right? So imagine if Konami for the last couple of years still had made very powerful theme, generic-esque cards. Their Pot of Greed, your Regekis, your, stuff like this. And then, they still want to make archetypes on the side. You would have these problems where the archetypes and the theme-based cards would clash constantly. The theme-based decks would get hit because these archetypes were too powerful. You would have to hit the theme-based cards. And I think what Konami eventually figured out, maybe, not trying to give Konami too much credit sometimes, but maybe they figured something out that maybe we should make things more archetype specific. Yeah, we can still make theme-based cards and generic cards, but maybe we should make things more archetype. Because if we do so, maybe, we can just hit those archetype specific cards. So, can you imagine every deck having Spellbook of Judgment? Can you imagine if, Spellbook of Judgment was like a broken card that could be used in multiple decks for different reasons? I'm just trying to say, like, if they made a Spellbook of Judgment-esque card that really helped, water-esque decks out. Just giving an example here. And then, another water archetype comes along and abuses that card. Then you have to hit that powerful card. That way that archetype doesn't become overpowerful and you can hit it in its own way. So what they did pretty much is they made things archetype specific. That way they can just hit the archetype and not just hit generic decks that want to pop up here and there. Now granted, I know people are going to say, well, right there and there, Thunder King, Macro, Defissure, etc., etc., etc. But those are kind of generic, aren't they? They're not just made specifically, you can only use this with, DDDs, DD Warriors, or things of that nature. They're generic-esque. They're kind of generic-esque. And if it was like an archetype-based card, kind of like, like what Stellanites have, they have their own judgment and stuff like that. If the archetype becomes too powerful, you can hit those specific cards and not hurt other decks that are using those cards. So if they hit Reinforcement Army again, because heroes became, masked heroes and heroes in general became too popular, it wouldn't just hurt hero decks, it would hurt other decks. And, that's not something that Konami wants to do. A good example, I guess you could say, is kind of Six Samurais. They hit Smoke Signal, kind of to some extent, but they left, I guess what I'm trying to get at, guys, is, at the end of the day, is I think that maybe at the end, if you understand where I'm going with this, is they could specifically target archetype cards if the archetype became too powerful. Instead of making generic cards that they're going to have to hit and that would hurt other decks and hurt their profit, they made archetypes. And they made more of them because if the deck became too powerful, we just hit these specific cards in the archetype, the deck goes back down to being a normal, steady deck. We can move on to the next deck and make some more money. And we don't have to worry about these other cards coming back to nip us in the butt. That's just my hypothesis. That's just a hypothesis. That's not a fact or anything. But that's my conclusion for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I know it was very, very, very complex maybe for some people out there, especially if you're not an old school player, and I do apologize for that. But this was a topic I just thought that we could discuss about. Not saying I'm right. I'm saying I could be completely wrong. You may just completely disagree with me. But it's just a thought. Like I say at the end of some videos, it's just a thought. For you guys to think about and say, maybe it is. That's why they did such and such a things Konami did. And, maybe archetypes have been around a lot longer than we thought of, just in a different form. So, hope you guys enjoy this video. I hope you took something away from it. You learned a little bit about Yu-Gi-Oh! History as well. I had fun doing this video, by the way. But, yeah. Hope you guys enjoy this, guys. Until next time, take care, have fun dueling, good luck dueling, and I'll see all of you guys next time. Seto Kaiba, I'm out of here, guys. Take care, everybody, and good luck dueling to all of you. Take care, everybody.